All right, so every society has, well, you could call it an emotional baseline, right? It's that shared feeling of what's good, what's admirable, but what happens when that baseline gets tilted? We're going to dive into a really fascinating source that asks what happens when a culture starts to value suffering more than joy. So let me just ask you this right off the bat. Is joy always a good thing? I mean, it sounds like a trick question, doesn't it? For a lot of us, the answer is a big, flashing yes. But what if it's not that simple? What if there are places where joy is actually kind of suspicious? And that question, well, that gets right to the heart of what our source material is all about. It makes the case that in modern Indian culture, there's this really deep-seated idea that values endurance, sacrifice. And joy? Well, joy is often seen as frivolous. At best, at worst, it's seen as a sign of some kind of moral weakness. So you gotta ask, how does a mindset like that even develop? Well, the thing is, according to this source, it's not some random accident. It's something that grew out of deep, deep historical roots. It's about a culture where just accepting hardship slowly, over time, morphed into glorifying it. And at the foundation of this is a concept called tapasya. Now, originally, this was just incredibly practical. Think about it. It was about discipline, restraint, endurance, all the tools you'd need to survive centuries of really tough stuff: scarcity, invasions, poverty. It was a survival kit, really. A means to an end, not the end itself. Okay, and this is where things get really, really interesting. You see this complete flip, this inversion of values. That practical need to endure pain, it didn't just stay practical. Over time, it hardened into a moral virtue. Suddenly, suffering became proof that you were a serious person, that you had depth. And on the flip side, joy, comfort, that stuff started to look suspicious. It was a sign of indulgence, maybe even moral decay. And look, this isn't just some dusty old philosophical idea, right? It bleeds directly into modern pop culture. The source points out how you see it everywhere. The news gravitates towards tragedy. In movies, how often do characters only earn their dignity after going through some immense sacrifice? Pain gets framed as the real human experience, while simple happiness? That's often dismissed as naive or unrealistic. Okay, so what's the actual cost of this? I mean, what's the real-world impact of a cultural mindset like this? What are the consequences, both socially and psychologically, when an entire society kind of distrusts joy? Well, the source brings up this really powerful idea. When life is just hard, day in and day out, endurance stops being a strategy, and it becomes an identity. To endure is to be strong. To suffer is to be virtuous. And this totally changes how people talk about their problems. It shows up in these common phrases you hear all the time.
You know the ones. You'll hear things like, "We survived worse."
Or maybe a dismissal of whatever's happening right now. This is nothing. And of course, the big one, the ultimate sign-off. That's how life is. And here's the crucial takeaway from the source. These phrases, they sound like resilience, and in a way they are. But they also act as a kind of conversation stopper. They can shut down any talk about whether all this suffering is actually necessary, or if maybe, just maybe, things could be better. But here's the thing about joy. You can't just erase it. The source makes this critical point. When you delegitimize joy, when you make it something to be suspicious of, it doesn't just vanish. No way. It just goes underground. It mutates. People still look for relief, but now it's through escapism or excess or even addiction, and it's all done in secret. So you get this crazy contradiction, a public face of seriousness and duty, and a private, desperate hunger for escape. So is that it? Is this kind of mindset just permanent? Well, not at all. And this is where the source offers some real hope. It uses what it calls a repair lens to look at other cultures that had a similar history of glorifying endurance and managed to evolve. Okay, first example, post-war Europe. I mean, think about it. After absolute devastation, they didn't just focus on rebuilding bridges and buildings. They made a conscious choice to rebuild life itself. They prioritized public holidays. They built parks and leisure spaces. They poured money into cultural life. Joy wasn't some fluffy luxury. It was framed as a totally pragmatic, essential part of social healing. Because, people just rebuild better when life actually feels worth living. Or take a look at several East Asian societies, right? Many are famous for their intense work cultures. But they started to shift. And you have to ask, why? Well, it wasn't some big moral awakening. It was pure pragmatism. The costs of burnout, of exhaustion, of the mental health crises, they just got too high to ignore. So what did they do? They reframed the whole conversation. Rest wasn't laziness anymore. It was a key to productivity. Balance wasn't a weakness. It was sustainability. It was just a smart response to a real problem. All right, so let's bring this all together. We've seen the problem. We've seen how other cultures have navigated this. So what's the path forward? How can a culture apply these lessons and make that huge shift from just surviving to actually living, and do it without losing all that historical depth and resilience? The source lays out a few really adaptable shifts. And it's crucial to say this isn't about some kind of fake, forced positivity. Not at all. It's about, number one, separating suffering from virtue, realizing that not all pain is noble. Some of it is just pointless. It's about normalizing rest, seeing it as basic maintenance, not a moral failing. It's about encouraging stories of just quiet, everyday well-being, stories that don't need a tragic setup to feel valid. And finally, it's about reframing joy itself, seeing it not as softness, but as a sign of real societal strength. And this right here really gets to the core of the whole argument. That ethic of endurance, it was absolutely 100% necessary. It helped India survive through some incredibly difficult times. But, and this is the big but, survival cannot be the final goal. The goal of any great civilization can't just be to survive. Eventually, it has to be about thriving. And that leaves us with this final, really powerful thought from the source. It completely reframes the whole idea of resilience. Maybe, true resilience isn't just about how much pain you can take. Maybe real resilience is having the courage to get rid of the pain you don't need to have and the wisdom to finally let life, with all of its messiness and all of its joy, actually be lived to the fullest. Definitely something to think about.